Welcome to Tales from the Bridge. This is episode 102, and today we have Robert Silverberg on the show. I think all of us felt pretty lucky, pretty honored to have Robert on the show with us today. He is such a smart, brilliant man. His memory is fantastic. The stories he tells us are so awesome. We are very happy to have Robert join us on the bridge. If this is your first time checking out Tales from the Bridge, go back and listen to some other episodes. We've got lots of interviews with authors, and we talk about books all the time. If you have not left a review or rated the show, please do so. We'd really appreciate that. Thank you for joining us today. All right, let's make our way over to the bridge.
Robert Silverberg is one of science fiction's most beloved writers, and the author of such contemporary classics as Dying Inside, Downward to the Earth, and Lord Valentine's Castle. He is a past president of the Science Fiction and Fantasy Writers of America and is the winner of 5 Nebula Awards and 5 Hugo Awards. At age 19, in 1954, Bob published his first works of science fiction, and since then has published over 618 distinct pieces of written literature, many of which have been republished many times over. In 2004, the Science Fiction and Fantasy Writers of America presented him with the Grand Master Award. Bob is a fixture in the science fiction community, having attended every single Hugo Awards ceremony since its inception in 1953, when he was 18 years old. Now, at age 89, Bob is busy arranging for new editions of his work and continues to write columns in the Asimov Science Fiction magazine. We are honored to have Bob here with us today to provide us with his perspective on the ongoing history of science fiction. Thanks for being here, Bob.
I'm glad still to be around.
Well, we're honored to have you. How's spring in San Francisco this year?
As usual, cool weather. We don't get very warm. We don't get very cold. And it's been a nice gray day here today. Very, very Bay Area.
You're in Oakland, right?
I'm in Oakland. I'm across the bay from San Francisco. I'm up in the hills. Nice fresh air. I like it here.
Have you been there? Have you been there for most of your life?
Actually, yes, it seems that way. I was born in New York, but I've been here more than 50 years. So it's quite a good chunk of my life. I don't think of myself quite as a Californian or a New Yorker. New York still clings to me in some ways, but I've been here most of the time.
So are you planning on attending Worldcon this year in Glasgow?
Yeah, I used to go to the Worldcon every year. Then we had a little pandemic interruption, and so I missed the New Zealand one, which didn't happen. And then they had one in Chicago right at the thick of COVID. I didn't feel like volunteering for that. So I broke my long Worldcon string. But this year it's in Glasgow. I haven't been overseas since the Dublin convention in 2019, and I'm looking forward to seeing all of my British friends this summer.
I feel like a little thing like a global pandemic gives you reason to not attend, honestly.
Well, yeah, I didn't get it. I got through the COVID years unscathed, but I'm not a young man, and I don't like to take medical risks if I can avoid them. And also, Chicago in August, it tends to be kind of hot.
Mm.
And after a long life in California where it never gets very warm or very cold, I've gotten a little allergic to very high temperatures. So I didn't go to Chicago.
Right. So you attended the very first Hugo Award. Is that correct?
I did. It was 1953. I had just made my first professional sale, though it wasn't fiction. It was an article about science fiction fandom. I was 18 years old. You had to pay $1 to attend the dinner, and I was a little short of dollars at the age of 18. So I sat in the balcony up above, and I looked down. The first Hugos were handed out, thinking, not someday I'll win one. Couldn't imagine that at all. But how interesting to be here and watching all these great science fiction writers who I've read, and they look just like human beings. 3 years later, I won a Hugo.
And you won that Hugo for Best New Writer, is that right?
Best New Writer, yes. What is now, I doesn't call it anymore, the Campbell Award. It's called something else now. But for the first few years, it was a Hugo. And when I won it, standing there somewhat bedazzled, Philip Jose Farmer's wife, Betty, came up to me and said in a very good-natured way, Phil is the last one who won this award, and he hasn't sold anything since. I hope things would get better.
And they did.
It did, yes.
Could you tell us about some of the people? You said that you were in the crowd watching that first time in 1953 and they look like humans. Who was out there? Who were you looking at and who was inspiring you at that time?
Well, the thing I most remember about that convention and the people I saw there was not at the Yugos itself, but in the convention hotel lobby one afternoon. And I was standing at the side of things with a young guy named Harlan Ellison, who was at the convention. In fact, we were rooming together. And I watched as five men crossed the lobby from one side to another. James Blish, Robert Sheckley, L. Sprague de Camp, Willie Lay, and I forget who the fifth man was now. But I thought, how splendid. Look at Sheckley. He's only 7 years older than I am. He's with all those great figures. I have never forgotten watching those guys cross the room. I think Fred Pohl, I think, was the fifth one. And of course, as time passed, I joined that group. I became friends with all of them. But it was a wonderful moment to see these great figures and realize they're just people. At the Yugos itself, nowadays, I think there are 20 categories or so. There were only four then. Best magazine, number one fan face, that was a category of that moment. I think artist, I don't remember. I mean, after all, we're talking about 75 years ago. Best magazine was a very awkward business because there were two magazines having a horrendous rivalry, Galaxy and what was then called Astounding Science Fiction. It's now Analog. And they were fighting each other for authors. They were imitating each other's cover formats. And here's the very first Yugos. Mysteriously, it ended in a tie.
Really?
Well, that was a way of ducking the issue. The Yugos were not voted for then by the members. They were chosen by the convention committee, and they saw no way of honoring one of those magazines without horrendously offending the other one. So we had the mysterious tie for the very first Yugos. I saw the Yugo that John Campbell of Astounding won. When I became, only 2 years later, I became one of his writers. And the Yugo was up in his office. And now a Yugo these days is an impressive looking silver spaceship. This one was made out of a Buick hubcap ornament. They improvised it. After all, the Yugo had just been invented. And there was a vertical metal object. And so Campbell had it in his office on a windowsill, and the dinkiest little thing, very sad, but it was the very first Yugo.
Wow. The very first.
How big was the community then? Because now there's a few thousand
Oh,
voters. How big was it then?
altogether different. The entire convention was in one building in the Bellevue Stratford Hotel. All the attendees, all the panels, everything under one roof. I think there were about 800 people. As time went along, the convention grew and grew and grew, and the biggest one, I believe, was in Los Angeles, and it was 5,000 or 6,000 people. But that one in Philly, and it was my first one, you got to know everybody the course of the weekend. It was a wonderful experience for a teenage would-be writer. I met editors who I would later be selling stories to. I met other writers. I met Harlan Ellison, which is a whole long story in itself.
Would it be fair to say that you were part of sort of the founding cohort of science fiction writers who would begin that genre as we know it today? Would that be too big a weight to put on your shoulders?
Well, I think it's a little exaggeration. There was a great new generation of writers just ahead of me. people born in the 1920s, I was born in the 1930s, who were reshaping science fiction in those early 1950s. People like Blish, Damon Knight, Algis Budrys, Jack Vance, on and on, Philip Jose Farmer. And they were already in business when I came along as a beginner. So I regard myself as sort of half generation beyond them. But of course, I became their contemporary as I started selling stories, and I became their friend and part of the social group. I was a kind of junior mascot in that group, but they were my friends and remained that way until I outlived them all.
And when you look back at that time, it feels like, the Hugos, to me, like it feels like that's sort of when things start to coalesce, and you're starting to see sci-fi become more prevalent in science fiction, become more prevalent in popular culture as well, right? Like, and
I hate that term sci-fi, but of course it's built into the culture now. Science fiction back then was a very much minority operation. We had the magazines, we had a couple of book publishers, not many, and reading it was something of a cult specialty. But then the first space rockets went up, the first science fiction movies made big hits, Destination Moon, Rocket Ship XM. And then, of course, we got Star Wars and Star Trek. And by the late 1960s, science fiction was no longer a cult. It was simply part of popular culture.
Now, can I ask why the term sci-fi rubs you the wrong way?
Well, because phi is not a good way to abbreviate fiction. Hi-fi is short for high fidelity, and that's where sci-fi came from. But I take words very seriously. Words, those are the tools of my trade. And I don't mind sci. I don't like it, but I don't mind it very much as short for science. But I do very much dislike phi as short for fiction, phi on it.
I find myself often when I'm describing books, I use science fiction, but when I'm talking about TV shows or movies, I'm more likely to say sci-fi. I find it's easier to flip-flop between the medias with that term.
Yeah, well, this is the medium for sci-fi. And I'm a sci-fi guy, I guess, but I will continue to tell people when they say, what do you do? I write science fiction. I do have a story on the stands right now in the new issue of Analog. It's 26 words long, and it's the first thing I've written in 13 years. It's just a joke.
Can you tell us about it?
Well, there's a famous little story by Frederick Brown that goes, the last man in the world was sitting alone in a room. There was a knock on the door. That's the whole story. One night, a couple of months ago, I was starting to wake up in the early hours of the morning, and in my head came, the last cat in the world was sitting alone in the room, and there was a knock on the door. The cat said, "Did you bring a can opener?" That's the story.
That's great.
And I thought, gee, that's flash fiction, as they now say, for Analog. I sent it off to Trevor Koshery, the editor, and behold, he paid me. It's the highest price I've ever received for a story per word, because it's only 26 words long.
It would be, wouldn't it? It paints a picture and makes the reader think.
This is Obsidian Recovery Agent Leo Braun. Subject is Philip Weston, age 38.
Only a few steps away now. If you obey, if you see me through this, we can unveil the plan in all its finality.
Philip, if you can hear me, I need you to know my name since I know yours. I'm Leo Braun.
Philip is sleeping.
Oh, can you wake him? I'd like to speak with him. Philip, you can't let them go.
You can kill them, Philip. You can kill them all. Yes,
And I'm a cat guy. I've always had cats around. I know what cats are like. If they were the last cat in the world and somebody knocked on the door, well, a cat can't open a can by itself.
Well, we've often joked that you can't be a science fiction author without having a cat. So we're glad to hear that you're also a cat person, Bob. Let me go back again to the 50s and 60s. And what some people might not know about you, although a lot will, is that you have written under different pen names. And what some readers might not realize is that you've written under many pen names to a tune of 57, perhaps. Can you talk a bit about why that is the case?
Uh, at the beginning of my career, I was, let's say, wildly prolific. I could write a story in the morning and take time out for lunch, and then write another one in the afternoon. And I think 1957, which was about the third year of my career, I sold 70 or 80 stories. The magazines couldn't run that many Robert Silverberg stories, cluttered up the contents page. So a lot of them went under pseudonyms. Eventually, I got less prolific and could not maintain that pace on into my later years. My favorite pseudonym story, when I was an early teenage reader, there was a magazine called Amazing Stories that ran a lot of fiction by somebody named Alexander Blade. And I read Alexander Blade's stories, and I thought, Alex, he's pretty good. What I didn't know was Alexander Blade was a pseudonym for a whole group of writers. It was a house name, and whenever somebody had too many stories in an issue, they threw one into Alexander Blade. 3 or 4 years later, I found myself at the age of 21, one of the house writers for Amazing Stories, and suddenly I was Alexander Blade. So I grew up to become my own pseudonym, but I haven't used pseudonyms in decades because I don't write even in the 70s and 80s. I wasn't writing that much, and there was no need to use a pseudonym.
You mentioned earlier that it was sort of when you were first starting, it was sort of first generation and a half of sci-fi writers coming up. Well, was there a turning point where it kind of stepped out of the cult realm and into the more mainstream realm that you remember? Was there a writer who you feel you kind of point to who kind of drove that change?
Well, one thing that drove it was Star Wars. Uh, suddenly everybody was seeing that movie, and it became mainstream entertainment. So far as writers went, there were always some writers going back to H.G. Wells and Aldous Huxley, who wrote genuine science fiction, but didn't write them for Amazing Stories. And it was very hard to cross that line. If you were a magazine writer, very difficult to compete with competing with H.G. Wells, A Fool's Game. He's the best one who ever wrote science fiction. Heinlein, I think, was the first of our crowd who actually moved out into leaving astounding science fiction and moving into the Saturday Evening Post and other big circulation magazines. And then he wrote Stranger in a Strange Land, which became a major bestseller. So he was, I think, the first of the pulp magazine writers to graduate into mainstream popularity.
When we look at the themes of a book like Man in the Maze, do those themes hold up today? How do you compare a book that's so important for the time? And I want to be specific about the Man in the Maze. How do those themes hold up today?
Well, I like to think they do. I know that The Man in the Maze holds up because it's still in print after, when did I write it? 1967. There was a new edition of it just last year. I think the fact that my books continue to find readers, and the fact that a podcast like this continues to want to talk to me, indicates that what I was writing, which I regarded as standard science fiction, nothing off the main path, still stands up today. Things have changed. A great deal has changed. But The Man in the Maze the theme of it, Earthman on an alien planet, well, that's inexhaustible.
Well, I've counted
Yeah.
22 editions of that book so
Very
far.
well. Very
So
well.
you're right. There are certainly there's obviously demand, and those are translations into I don't know how many languages. So certainly there's still certainly a lot of people who want to read it.
So one interesting thing about longevity, and I've now had one of the longest careers of anybody. I'm here to keep maneuvering my product around. Just the other day, and of course, the advent of email makes it much easier. The other day, I got an email from a publisher in Italy, said we'd like to do a little book of your short stories, and I answered in Italian, sure, certo. This goes on all the time. Some writers, some very good writers who died a long time ago, are starting to vanish from sight because nobody is looking after their heritage. And I'm still here looking after mine.
And what is the best route for that? How does someone steward someone's literary legacy after
Well,
they passed?
after they pass, well, you need an estate that pays some attention. You need an agent who is looking after the affairs of that estate. And some writers, I don't think the very fine books of James Blish are still in print, for example. Uh, Jim's widow is off in Greece. I don't know who's looking after the estate. And there's a great writer of the 1950s and 60s whose work is becoming quite obscure. I say James Blish, and people say, who? Sturgeon, I don't know whether his work is maintaining. Harlan Ellison, who died just a few years ago, has somebody very active in promoting his work, and new editions will be coming out.
Can I ask specifically about someone like Harlan Ellison? You said that you guys were you living together or just staying together for the Hugos, but you guys were about the same age and aspiring writers?
Yeah, he was 6 months older.
Oh, much older. Okay.
Let him forget it. He called me. He lived in Cleveland, then I lived in New York. And making a phone call at that distance then was quite an extraordinary thing. I remember my father coming into my room and saying, there's some fellow from Cleveland calling you, as though his call was from Mars. Well, he wanted to know if I was going to the convention. I said, yeah, it would be my first convention, just down the road from New York to Philadelphia. He said, well, let's room together. Well, we knew each other through the world of science fiction fandom. We were both readers. We both wrote for the amateur magazines. We both wanted to be writers, and were desperately trying to break through. So we agreed to room together. We met at that convention. It was the Bellevue Stratford, the fanciest hotel in Philadelphia, and we rented a suite. And then we proceeded to rent out floor space to all of our friends at $5 a night. We went home with a big pocket full of money. And then not much longer, I was in college then. He had just flunked out of college. Not many months later, he turned up in New York. And I said, I'm going to come to New York and be a famous writer. I said, well, sure. And I was living near Columbia University, and he moved in next door to me. So this is 53, 54, 55. I graduated. He went into the Army. I became a writer, and about a year later, so did he. And we had about a 60-year, very complicated friendship. I could write 3 books about that friendship, but I'm not going to do it. Very interesting, turbulent, fascinating, difficult man.
Mm-hmm. And would you say that the two of you inspired each other to write? If one of you wasn't there in that relationship, would Mr. Ellison have written the way he did? Do you think he would have done it no matter what? Or seeing your success early on, did that inspire him to write? Did you guys ever talk about that?
Both. We certainly had a kind of friendly rivalry. We kept an eye on each other, and when one of us sold something, the other was quite aware of it. But we were both highly motivated. Young science fiction readers desperately wanting to have stories in those magazines.
And did he get along with a lot of other writers? Because I've seen him with even someone like Isaac Asimov, who is so polite and generous. and there's some arguing sometimes, and I guess that's just Mr. Ellison he liked to kind of really go for it. He just had so much life in him, didn't he?
Well, he had the same kind of relationship with everybody. Everybody loved him. Everybody hated him. He drove us all crazy, but nevertheless, we were fascinated by him. As for Isaac, they were very good friends. I remember one moment, though, at some convention, I don't know, 40 years ago. Harlan and I were standing by the elevator, waiting to go up to an upper floor, and the elevator came down. And the door opened, and standing in it were Isaac Asimov and Randall Garrett, a writer who physically looked something like Isaac. They were both stocky men of medium height. And Harlan pointed to them and said, Tweedledum and Tweedledee. And Isaac, who was as quick on the uptake as any human being, said, I'm D.
Oh, that's excellent. Well, and you went on to author with Isaac Asimov, starting with Nightfall in the 1990s. How did that come about?
Well, that's actually a sad story. Isaac
Oh,
was ill. Isaac, though he didn't know it, had contracted AIDS through a blood transfusion, and he was very gradually dying. At the same time, his publisher, who had made a best-selling writer out of him, I mean, really best-selling, not just science fiction kind of best-selling, but New York Times best-selling. The publisher was pushing him to write more novels, and he couldn't do it. He's sick. Well, Isaac and I had a very close mutual friend, Martin Harry Greenberg, and Marty said to Isaac, Bob could expand some of your old novellas into novels, and you could publish them as collaborations, and then you'd keep your publisher happy, you'd stay visible. How about it? And Isaac said, great. And next thing I know, we had a gigantic deal with Doubleday, and the first book was Nightfall, which we worked on together. He had ideas about how to expand his famous novel. But by the time I got to the third one, which was an expansion of The Bicentennial Man, about the robot who wants to become human by learning how to die, Isaac himself was just about dead. He never read that book. One other aspect of that collaboration, the publisher was Doubleday, who had been Isaac's publisher since way back. And he had a very benevolent attitude toward Doubleday. Not all of us loved Doubleday. They could be pretty rough. And we got a great deal of money for those books. And Isaac said to me, well, what if Doubleday loses money on them? I couldn't care less. The publisher had paid too much money for the books. Well, that's the publisher's problem.
sure they didn't.
For Doubleday, what if they lose money?
So they started with Nightfall. I think it had recently been made into a major motion picture a couple years before you did the
Very
right.
terrible movie, apparently. I never saw it. Nightfall, and then The Ugly Little Boy, one about the Neanderthal child, and then The Bicentennial Man, which did get made into a movie with Robin Williams.
And that was partially based on that novel, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, that was the one that I wrote single-handedly. Isaac never saw it.
No.
I simply continued the story. Most of the movie is actually the book that I wrote out of that story.
Mhm.
But I used his basic idea. I built it on what he had created.
What was that like then? What was your experience with watching someone like Robin Williams play out a character that you created with Isaac? And what was your involvement with the film, if any?
Oh, well, it was filmed near here. It was filmed in the Bay Area. And I would go down to watch the filming. I never interfere with anything, any adaptation of my work. It's my work, and now it's your movie, and I'm not going to mess with it. But I wanted to watch what was going on, and Chris Columbus, the director, invited me to come down and watch it. And I met Robin Williams, and we got along very well. And it's a wonderful moment. There was a basketball court there on the set, and Robin found a basketball somewhere, and he threw it over his shoulder right into the basket. Now, he was a quick-witted guy, and very agile, but even he was surprised at that. Anyway, I was happy to watch the filming. I met various of the actors. I did not interfere in any way with what they were doing.
I wanted to ask, when you look back at your extensive body of work, is there a piece that you're most proud of?
Well, it varies from day to day. I think the Dying Inside, significant science fiction novel. I wrote a historical novel called Lord of Darkness that almost nobody knows about, which extremely long novel about an English and Elizabethan voyager who gets stranded in Africa in the 17th century and actually the 16th century. And I think that is an extraordinary book that I'm very happy to say is coming back into print, like most of my books, this December. So there's the one side and the other. Dying Inside as a science fiction novel, and Lord of Darkness as this enormous, complex historical novel. And then there's Lord Valentine's Castle, which was a lot of fun to write and it's a lot of fun to read. I started reading it myself the other day.
Well, I have to say, as someone who's read Lord Valentine's Castle, the writing is so beautiful. I'm actually like, I've only read your science fiction, so to jump into something that's more science fantasy and have that kind of medieval feel to it, the writing it's notably different from science fiction. So you must have got into a different mindset even to say, I'm going to write something more fantasy and my language is going to be a little bit different.
When I pitched Lord Valentine's Castle, and I wrote an 18-page outline that got the attention of publishers very quickly, I called it a magical mystery tour, a phrase that used to mean something in our society. I wanted it to be fun. I had written a couple of gloomy novels, Dying Inside. In fact, the last few things I wrote had titles like Born with the Dead, The Book of Skulls, Dying Inside. You can see a dark tone there. I wanted to change the tone, and I wanted to write a book that was fun, and it was. There's a new edition of that. There's a new edition of everything coming around, and I was looking at it, and before I knew what I was doing, I had read the first 40 pages, my own book. But I wrote these books so long ago that I can read them almost as an outsider. But I stopped after the 40 pages because I knew what was going to happen.
I do see direct, I mean, maybe I'm just making this up, but I see influence in more modern writers. Patrick Rothfuss's series, The Kingkiller Chronicles, there's a lot of elements that I see in Lord Valentine's Castle in that series. Has any author ever said, "Hey, your books have helped me write, and these were great inspiration for the series that I'm writing or the story I'm writing"?
Oh yeah, I hear that. I like it. When I began writing, I thought of myself as part of a continuity. There were writers who influenced me. I learned the craft by studying their work. Henry Kuttner, particularly a writer no longer really remembered. Jack Vance, Sheckley. There were 5 or 6 of them who I looked at very closely. I said, how are they doing this? And then I wrote my own books. And of course, I want to believe that I'm continuing the chain and that people following me have been looking at my books, and apparently they have. I certainly hope so.
Well, and it is noteworthy to look at some of your other work that you've done. Of course, in our world, we think about the science fiction, but the historical nonfiction, fantasy, crime fiction.
I was a busy boy, yeah.
You've been a busy boy. Any other genres that you've written in?
I wrote a whole slew of erotic novels.
Did you?
Yeah. My friend, Mr. Ellison, went to Chicago and took a job as an editor. And he said, I'm going to run a line of sexy novels. How'd you like to write some? Well, usually when someone says, how would you like to write X? My answer is, why not? And the publisher, a man named William Hamling, was publishing a science fiction magazine called Imagination that I was writing 3 or 4 stories an issue for. And Hamling said, yeah, come on, Bob, write me some stuff. So I wrote a slew of novels about people getting themselves into sexual entanglements. There, my influence was not Jack Vance or Henry Kuttner, it was Georges Simenon. And then I stopped. I mean, it was fun. It was profitable. People collect those books today. Every now and then I get the request to sign them. I wrote two
Was that easier to write or more difficult to write?
Oh, easier to write than science fiction. I didn't have to make up a world. I could
True.
set it right here now. I wrote 2 or 3 Western stories. I wrote a bunch of crime stories. 1962, I went to Italy and I visited Pompeii. When I came back, I told my agent, Pompeii had a great impact on me. I'd never seen anything like that, or there is nothing like that. He said, well, I want to write a book about it. And suddenly I had a whole new career writing books about archaeology. I did that for about 8-10 years. And then I went back to science fiction and basically did nothing but science fiction right to the end.
What type of science fiction do you enjoy today? Do you watch movies, television shows? Are you reading books?
I don't watch television shows. I see the occasional science fiction movie, but not lately. I feel more comfortable taking the Jack Vance down from the shelf, or Phil Dick, or even getting back to my roots with Henry Kuttner than the current fiction, because a lot of the current science fiction seems to be much too closely related to the real world out there, and that's not what I go to science fiction for.
And just because you said his name, but did you live in the Bay Area with Philip K. Dick when he was there? There's some interesting stories with him in that area, and if you were there, you may have been a part of them.
I remember one night having dinner with Phil and some girlfriend of his. He always had a sequence of girlfriends, and Terry Carr, the editor, and his wife Carol. Phil's girlfriend got very drunk at the table. We were having some kind of conversation at the table, and suddenly he turned to her and said, quite casually, your lip sync is off. Then went right back to talking with the rest of us. And that seemed to be a very Phil Dickian thing to do. Your lip sync is off. The last time I saw him, not long before his death, we were sitting in a convention lobby, and we had a conversation in broken Latin. I studied Latin in high school, Phil apparently the same. And though neither of us was very good, we would not have passed muster at the Vatican. We were busy fumbling around in Latin with each other. He was a very unusual man.
Sounds that way.
His career began only 2 or 3 years before mine, but I looked upon him as an influence and as somebody to admire. He suddenly burst out with all those wonderful stories all at once in 1952, 53, and I thought, gee, I wish I could do that. And then I wrote a lot of stories.
Just a few years later.
It seemed like a long time between my discovering Philip K. Dick and my suddenly having 20 stories in all the magazines.
We had a conversation with Joe Haldeman just a couple months ago, and he's another Grandmaster recipient. And it occurred to me that he was only 10 when you went to your first Hugo Awards.
Joe is, I think, 80, but I think of him as a promising new writer.
Do you tell him that?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, we spent a lot of time with the Haldemans. Went down to Monterey, California with them last year. That gap of nearly a decade, but of course my career started much earlier. He was interrupted by little business in Vietnam. So he didn't actually begin selling stories until he was well along toward 30. And I was already a ghastly prolific writer at the age of 21. Good friend. I'm looking forward to seeing him in Glasgow at the Worldcon this year.
Every year you get to have an excuse to see friends you haven't seen in a while.
Yeah, I think of the Worldcon as a family reunion, although not much left of what I regard as a family anymore, but Joe's still hanging in there. Reminds me, I almost wrote the first Star Trek movie.
Really?
I never paid any attention to Star Trek, the show. Gene Roddenberry came to the 1966 convention to collect a bunch of writers to write for it. He did. He collected Harlan and Norman Spinrad and David Gerald and a few others. But I wasn't interested because I was writing. I didn't know much about television. I didn't want to learn, so I paid no attention. One day in 1975, I get a call from somebody in Los Angeles, said, are you interested in writing the Star Trek movie? I have never even watched Star Trek. But I'm quick on my feet, and I said, sure. What do I have to do? He said, well, come down to LA and we'll talk about it. And I hastily watched a bunch of Star Trek. Oh, Spock, McCoy, yeah. And it was showing on our TV station every night. I watched about 5 of them one week. Then I went to LA and I met Robert Wise, who was the director, and a guy named Trabulus, who was the head of Paramount. And I pitched a story. I said, fine, go home and write a treatment. I'm not a Hollywood guy. I went home and I wrote treatment. They sent me a lot of money. And then Gene Roddenberry called. He had been off in England while all this was going on. And he had pitched a story that had been rejected. And he said, how in hell did you get involved in this? Because he knew I wasn't interested in his show. I said, I have no idea, Gene. Then Trabulus got fired and the whole project got canceled and they never did my story, but I got my check.
They did pay you a bit anyway.
Oh, Hollywood, they're rigorous about paying. It's one of the really good things about them. You get any kind of deal and you get the check the next day.
Could you release that treatment?
I have it.
Could you sell it, or there would be, I guess, there'd be issues with that?
Who has the rights to it, really?
Yeah.
I suspect that since I was paid a goodly sum for it, it belongs to Paramount. I don't know who owns Paramount these days. I saw someone was dickering to buy the studio.
It might be worth it to get sued by them just for the good publicity and the good sale.
That's good, called good legal advice.
Yeah,
Try to get sued by them.
That's very nice. You know, I'm going to be 90 in not very long, and I have never yet been sued. So it's time to start.
By Star Trek or Paramount. You mentioned new books coming out in December. So what should our listeners be looking for?
New work. All you'll see is my 26-word story in this month's analog. But publisher Blackstone Books is publishing 4 of my old novels, starting with the historical novel Lord of Darkness, which I hope everybody finally discovers, and up the line and 2 or 3 other of my earlier books. There's always something new coming out, but it's always something old new. Where I'm most active, 21st century guy that I'm not, is online. Publisher called Open Road has nearly all my work available in electronic form for your Kindle or your whatever gadget. You find everything I wrote there.
It's really awesome to meet you, and just really appreciate everything you've done for literature.
Well, it's been fun talking to you, and if I have an anecdote or 2 left, maybe we can do this again.
Yeah, I'm sure you do.
That's wonderful.
Thank you, Robert, for joining us. Thank you, listeners. We really appreciate you. Remember, leave a review. Let us know what you think of the show. Join us again. Much more to come on Tales from the Bridge. Until next time.